Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So, after mentioning the argument for the fact that the universe began to exist, Imam Taftazani, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on him, he says, Waha huna abhath. He says there's four abhath. And he mentions four abhath, and these four abhath, these are part of a dialectic exchange between him and the Falasifa. So he says there are four objections that the Falasifa may raise against the Mutakallimun. And so he's going to mention those objections, and then he's going to respond to those objections. So the nature of Sharh al-Aqaid is that it's strongly dialectic, which means that it's strongly grounded in a particular back and forth between the mutakallimun and the falasifa. And it's not, the opposite, the counterpart of dialectic, sometimes called synthetic. Synthetic is you start from first principles, you organize the argument, you try to forget about the person who you're arguing with, and you present an argument in general. Forgetting the person who you're arguing with. And Taftazani, he attempts that, but but now, because the environment of Taftazani has changed, we can see that he's still in this dialectic. And maybe, when we try to take him out of this dialectic and present the argument in a more general way, maybe, in a later time, people will look at us and say that we're in a dialectic too, because we are trying to express things in terms of atoms and molecules and matter and energy and Big Bang and all of these things. And maybe in 100 years from now, that worldview will change, or significant aspects of it will change. And so things that we say right now, when they look back at them at that time, they're going to say that this is that Hamza was he's trying to be synthetic, but he was unsuccessful because he is involved in he's using the terms and making assumptions about what's going on around him, and we now know that these assumptions are not true. So want to keep this in mind, and wants to take from this that the goal of Taftazani, what is Taftazani attempting to do? Imam Taftazani is trying to help people, and so he's trying to help people. He's looking at the people around him, and he's looking at the way that they think, the kinds of ideas that they have in their mind, and how they would respond, and he's trying to give responses to those responses. And that's why it looks like this. And in our times, if we were to do something similar, it would also be in this manner, that we would present things because our goal is to help people. So that's why it's like this. So what we want to do is, just as in the previous two lessons, I want to go through what Imam Taftazani is saying and explain the dialectic, the back and forth between the two, and not dwell on doing a tahqiq, and this is, and really it's like this, and really it's like this. We just want to understand the back and forth at this stage. And then after we understand the back and forth, after this lesson, we're going to step back and we're going to look at the cosmological argument and the debate, the dialectic that exists today. And we're going to examine that, and we're going to try and apply some of the things that we learned, some of the principles of Taftazani. And then we'll return to what he says when he talks about Huduth al-Alam, and things will become clearer. So you have to be patient a little bit with me, a little bit. Wants to focus now just on the dialectic and understanding what it is that the opponents of Taftazani are saying, and what he is saying, and how they're talking to each other. And we have to be patient, because some of the assumptions that they're making, some of the principles that they're working with might seem foreign to us, might seem irrelevant to us. We might disagree with some of them, but we're just going to step back and understand the dialectic. So he says, وَهَا هُنَا أَبْحَاث. What's the first bahth? He says, الأول الأول, he says, is أنه لا دليل على انحصار الأعيان في الجواهر والأجسام. So the Falasifa, what did they believed in the existence of mujarradat. Mujarrad, something that's mujarrad, is something that doesn't occupy space. It doesn't have a location. They believed in the existence of contingent things that don't have a location. So Taftazani, he began by saying that the alam is either jawahir and a'rad, and they're both haditha, and therefore al-alamu hadith. And so he says that that you haven't proved your point, because there's he says that there's this is an objection of the Falasifa, that there's no proof that that the a'yan, the things in the universe, are confined to jawahir, physical the particles, and ajsam, and physical objects. وأنه, and this is معطوف on لا دليل على this, and لا دليل على أنه تمتنع على أنه يمتنع. In my copy I have يمتنع, that's better. وأنه يمتنع وجود ممكن يقوم بذاته ولا يكون متحيزا أصلا. And there's no proof that it's impossible for a contingent thing to exist that يقوم بذاته. يقوم بذاته means that it exists independently. It exists independently. ولا يكون متحيزا أصلا. And it doesn't have a location. So a'rad, they don't exist independently, and they have a location secondarily, in a derivative way. Their location is the location of the mahal that they occupy. So he's saying that there's no dalil that أنه يمتنع وجود ممكن يقوم بذاته ولا يكون متحيزا أصلا كالعقول والنفوس المجردة التي يقول بها الفلاسفة. So in the Hawashi, they're going to give they're going to say what are uqul and what are nufus, and they'll explain the philosophy of the Falasifa. This is not really relevant to us. So I'm going to give a high level overview just so we can understand this. But exactly what a aql is and what a nafs is, and it's not useful, because people don't believe in this anymore. And but the people who Taftazani was arguing against, they did believe in it, and that's why he is mentioning this. So what the Falasifa said, they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God, is one. And they said they had a number of principles. So one of their principles was that al-wahid la yasduru minhu illa wahid. They said that somebody who's one, there can only be multiple things can't come from him, but only one thing can come from him. Where did they get this from? They just assumed it. It was just an assumption that they worked on, and it was widely accepted. Similar in our times, there's an assumption that everything that exists is a physical object. This is materialism, and that's just an assumption that scientists work on, and it's widely accepted as fact. And similarly, in those times, this was an assumption that was widely accepted as fact. And so they said that the universe, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, or God is one, and they said that the universe, which is variegated, it proceeded from God through a series of emanations. In English we call them emanations. In Arabic they're called fayd, or something like that, or sudur. So this emanation was non-volitional. And so they said that from God, non-volitionally, there came a aql. It's called the aql awal, intellect. And then there's a second aql, and then there's a third aql, and at each level, the variegation of the universe increases, and things become more and more variegated, and they become more distant from God, who is one. And so now it becomes more possible to have a universe that is variegated. And these uqul, they said, are jawahir mujarrada, which means they're ayan, They're things that don't have a location. And they also posited the existence of nufus. Nufus are souls. Souls are also things that don't have a location. And the difference between a aql and a nafs is that a aql does not, it doesn't have, they say that al-aql ليست متعلقة بالجسم تعلق تدبير بل تعلق تأثير فقط. So a aql, it doesn't do tadbir, it doesn't have irada, it doesn't plan, it doesn't design, but rather it simply has an effect. So the aql, it is related to ajsam. What are ajsam? Ajsam are physical objects that have a location, and through this series of emanations, they end in the creation or the coming into existence of physical objects. And so the uqul, they bring about the existence of physical objects. They cause the physical objects to exist, but they don't have any design or purpose because they don't have volition, they don't have irada. So the aql does not relate to the jism by way of tadbir, but it relates to the jism by way of ta'thir only, bringing it into existence. But a nafs, a human soul, or another kind of soul, it's also related to ajsam. So our soul is related to our body, which is a jism. And what's the relation of our nafs to our body? The relation is a relation of tadbir. It oversees, it moves the jism in this way, it moves the jism in that way. And both the uqul and nufus are mujarrad, are jawahir mujarrada. They don't occupy a location. And so the mutakallimun, they say, the falasifa, they would object here that your argument is based on the assumption that the only thing that exists are a'rab and ajsam, and both of these have physical locations, and you based your argument on that because what is your argument based on? Your argument is based on movement and stillness. The argument that Taftazani gave, it took one a'rab, which is movement and stillness. And what is movement and stillness? Movement is to be in a different location in the second moment than you were in the previous moment. And stillness is to be in the same moment, in the same location in the second moment that you were in the previous moment. So both movement and stillness are related to location. And they only apply to physical objects. But if there exist things that are not physical objects, that don't have a location, then the argument that you, O Taftazani, have presented doesn't apply because there is no movement or stillness. So this is the i'tirad, this is the objection to the argument. Taftazani, he brings this objection. He might, some of these objections, maybe he just thinks of them. He said they could say this and this is how we would respond. And perhaps some of these objections were actually made. He said, ها هنا أبحاث الأول أنه لا دليل على انحصار الأعيان في الجواهر والأجسام وأنه يمتنع وجود ممكن يقوم بذاته ولا يكون متحيزا أصلا. Like what? كالعقول والنفوس المجردة التي يقول بها الفلاسفة. والجواب. So Taftazani gives a response. What's his response? He says, أن المدعى حدوث ما ثبت وجوده بالدليل من الممكنات. So he said there's a claim. So this is based on, so this dialectic is based on it's based on a science, and that science is ilm al-bahthi wal-munazara. Ilm al-bahthi wal-munazara, you learn the proper way of presenting an argument and critiquing an argument. So in ilm al-bahthi wal-munazara, you have someone called the mu'allil. The mu'allil, I forget what he's called, whether the mu'allil is the mudda'i, but you have somebody who's presenting the argument. The one who's presenting the argument is making the da'wah, and the da'wah is the claim, and the one who's presenting the argument is making the claim, and it's his responsibility to prove the claim. And then you have somebody else who's critiquing it. Mujib, I think it's al-mu'allil al-mujib. And the one who is critiquing the argument, he tries to find faults in it. And there's certain things that the one who is making the argument can say, and there's certain things that the one who's critiquing the argument can say. And if they follow these rules, then the exchange will always result in either the one who is making the argument being successful, proving his case, or the one who is critiquing the argument silencing the one who is making the case. And so one of the strategies here is that the one who is making a da'wah, he's making a claim, the one who's presenting the argument. And so the claim is al-alamu hadith. And so al-alamu jawahir wa a'rad, this is the claim. This is a broad claim. And so they say that, well, we don't agree that al-alamu jawahir wa a'rad. And so what do? You make the claim, you restrict the claim. You restrict the claim to prevent the one who is critiquing you from undermining your argument. So what does he do? He restricts the claim. He says, أن المدعى, it's not حدوث alam technically, but it's حدوث ما ثبت وجوده بالدليل من الممكنات. So our claim is that everything whose existence is established by evidence, all contingent things whose existence is established by evidence is hadith. And we have evidence for the fact that a'rad and ajsam exist, and this is what we're proving is hadith. And we're restricting our claim, we're not making a broader claim than this. And if you want to now bring in things that don't have a location, then you have to we're only going to consider them if there's evidence that they actually exist. If there's no evidence that they actually exist, we're not going to consider them. So he says al-jawab an al-mudda'a حدوث ما ثبت وجوده بالدليل من الممكنات. So the mutakallimun, they only believe in the existence of physical objects that have a location. This is a scientific position. It's not an aqidah position, because if somebody believes in the existence of things that don't have a location, it doesn't violate their aqidah in any way. It doesn't undermine your aqidah in any way, as long as you believe that they're contingent and that they began to exist. But they said that on philosophical terms and scientific terms, this is what exists, and we're not going to accept the existence of anything else, because there's no evidence for it. There's insufficient evidence that there are mumkinat. There are mumkinat that don't have a location. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not from the mumkinat. He doesn't have a location. And we have a dalil for that. But the fact that there are mumkinat that don't have a location, there's no dalil for it. So this is our argument. And so the mumkinat that have been established with a dalil, if you examine them, their huduth is evidence for the existence of God, and it's a correct argument. And there's nothing and the argument is not undermined in any way. He says that since these things are hadith, they prove the existence of someone who's not hadith, who exists necessarily. And we'll deal with mujarradat when you prove that they exist. He says, وَالْجَوَابْ أَنَّ الْمُدَّعَى حُدُوثُ مَا ثَبَتَ وُجُودُهُ بِالدَّلِيلِ مِنَ الْمُمْكِنَاتِ وَهُوَ الْأَعْيَانُ الْمُتَحَيِّزَةُ وَالْأَعْرَاضِ. So what is it that ثَبَتَ وُجُودُهُ من الممكنات? It is الأعيان المتحيزة. أعيان يعني objects that have a location and their properties. So why is it restricted to those things? He says لأن أدلة وجود المجردات غير تامة على ما بين في المطولات. Because the arguments for the existence of mujarradat are incomplete. They're not sound arguments. And Al-Bajuri, Imam Al-Bajuri, who has a hashiyah on the first part of Sharh Al-Aqaid, he explains that the adilla of the non-existence of the mujarradat are also ghair tamma. So there's no conclusive proof that they exist, and there's also no conclusive proof that they don't exist. And so the mutakallimun say we're going to work on we're going to just put them aside and just work with the things that we have a dalil for their existence. He says لأن وجود المجردات غير تامة على ما بين في المطولات, as is explained in longer works, and he's not getting into this. He's not taking this argument to its completion. He's just confining himself to this because he just wants to give you an idea, and we're going to confine ourselves to this as well, because so what are we doing? The way that we're studying this is we're understanding what he's saying, we're learning the principles, we're trying to extract from it what's relevant to us in our times, and we have a general idea of what the discussions are and where to find them. So in the future, if there comes an issue that requires referencing what the mutakallimun said about the existence of mujarradat and its relation to our aqidah, we know it's here, we can go and look it up later on. So, but at this moment, it doesn't really affect us. So we're going to put it aside. So that's the first objection and its answer. And I want you to note that it's a dialectic exchange. So Taftazani here, he's saying that if they say this and they object to this, then I'm going to analyze this, and this is the general way in which we'll respond. And if they say this, then this is what it means, and this is the general way in which we'll respond. He's trying to train the reader in the art of critical thinking and also the art of defending an argument, and that's his high-level purpose, and it's dialectic. So he says athani. What's the second objection? He says the second objection, anna ma dhukira la yadullu ala huduthi jami' al-a'rad. Why is this? He says that your argument, you confined your argument to movement and stillness. So you just proved that movement and stillness are created. But movement and stillness are just two out of many other a'rad. What about color? What about darkness? What about light? He says, أَنَّ مَا ذُكِرْ لَا يَدُلُّ عَلَى حُدُوثِ جَمِيعِ الْأَعْرَاضِ, is because منها ما لم يدرك بالمشاهدة حدوثه ولا ولا حدوث أضداده. So he gave the example of movement and stillness. When something is moving becomes still, or vice versa, then one thing goes out of existence and one thing comes into existence. But if you look around, and he says that if you look up he gives the example. He says كالأعراض القائمة بالسماوات من الأضواء والأشكال والامتدادات. He says such as the a'rad, such as the properties that al-qa'ima bis-samawat. The samawat, according to Taftazani, the samawat are spheres. They're celestial spheres. So when he says, what's the sama? The sama is a jirm. So according to Taftazani, there's the earth in the middle, and there is a sphere around the earth that is rotating, and it's the rotation of this sphere is what results in the movements of the stars. And then there's another sphere outside of that, another sphere, and there's 7 spheres. And these 7 spheres are the 7 heavens that are mentioned in the Quran. This is based on his natural philosophy. We don't, that's not what we believe stars and to be anymore. And this is based also on a model of the universe in which the earth is the center and everything else is revolving around it, which we also no longer believe. But we want to understand the dialectic. And so in order to understand the dialectic, we want to understand what he's saying. What he's saying is that he's mentioning an objection of the Falasifa, and they say that the samawat are actual physical objects, they're spheres, and there are a'rad, there are properties that subsist in these samawat, such as lights. What are the lights? These are the stars. So there's lights in these celestial spheres, and the spheres move, and that's why the stars, they rise and they set. He says, wal ashkal wal imtidadat. Ashkal are forms. So things, they have a form, they look a particular way. You look at a mountain, it has a form, and as far as you're concerned, the form of the mountain does not change. It's been like that. It's always going to be like that. And it's always been like that. We now know that mountains, their forms, do change, and they come as a result of tectonic plates pressing against each other. But in his time, the mountains would be something that you don't observe their forms to change. Wal imtidadat are dimensions. So something having 3 dimensions. So he just mentions properties that don't change. So he's saying that these properties are not observed to change. Movement and stillness, they are observed to change. But these properties, they're not observed to change. And so they used to think when they looked at the heavens that the heavens are unchanging. They always remain the same way. They don't change. And these celestial spheres are rotating, and they've always rotated, and they don't have a beginning to their rotation, and they will not have an end to their rotation. And this is where time comes from. Why does time comes from this? Because we use this rotation when the stars go and the sun is also in a sphere and it moves around. That's how we measure time. The rising and setting of the sun, the movement of the moon. And so that's why they used to say that time is the movement of the celestial spheres. Harakatul aflak. Falak in the terminology of the mutakallimun is the celestial sphere. It's different than falak in the Quran. So in the Quran, kullun fi falakin yasbahun. When you read a tafsir, what will the mufassir say? He will translate falak as a celestial sphere. And when he talks about the samawat, you read Imam al-Razi, he will assume that the 7 heavens are these 7 celestial spheres. When he does that, he is bringing his scientific knowledge into his interpretation of the Quran. It's no longer valid. Okay? And we need to, and there are many other things like this in the Quran, and all of these discussions in our tafsir literature, they all need to be updated. So this is the objection. So the objection here is that there are a'rad, there are properties that don't change, that aren't observed to change. And that's what he believes. We now know that many of these do actually change. He says, wal jawab. What's the response? He says, wal jawab. He says, anna hadha ghayru mukhillin bil gharab. This doesn't come in the way of what we're trying to prove. Why not? He says, لأن حدوث الأعيان يستدعي حدوث الأعراض. So what is he saying? There's something that's implied. What he is saying is that if I focus merely on movement and stillness, and I use these 2 a'rad to prove that all ajsam are haditha, because they're all moving and either moving or still, then if the a'yan are haditha, then now all of the other properties that they have must also be hadith, because the a'yan are haditha. So I only need to use movement and stillness. I don't need to discuss the other a'rad, because through movement and stillness I can prove that the a'yan are haditha. And once I do that, it follows from that all of the other a'rad that you mentioned are also hadith, because they only exist if the ayn exists, and the ayn is hadith. So he says, and that's what he's saying, that huduth al-a'yan, which I prove through just movement and stillness, yastad'i huduth al-a'rad. Why? ضرورة, this is مفعول من أجله, ضرورة أنها لا تقوم إلا بها. Because of the necessity, because it's necessarily the case that these a'rad, which I haven't discussed, لا تقوم إلا بها. They don't have any subsistence except through the existence of the a'yan. And so since the a'yan are haditha, the a'rad must also be haditha. So this is another objection and a response to that objection. The third objection, الثالث. What's the third objection? He says الثالث. This objection is a little bit more involved. This objection returns to this last statement that Taftazani made. He said that وَأَمَّا الْمُقَدِّمَةَ الثَّانِيَةَ. The second muqaddimah, what was that? مَا لَا يَخْلُو عَنِ الْحَوَادِثِ فَهُوَ حَادِث. Anything that is characterized by hawadith must itself be hadith. Why? He says فَلِأَنَّ ما لا يخلو عن الحادث لو ثبت في الأزل لزم ثبوت الحادث في الأزل وهو محال. So he's now going to analyze this statement. ما لا يخلو عن الحادث لو ثبت في الأزل لزم ثبوت الحادث في الأزل وهو محال. And he's going to criticize two things. First, he's going to criticize the use of the word fi. And then as he's doing that, he's going to criticize something else. So he says, the third is الثالث أن الأزل ليس عبارة عن حالة مخصوصة حتى يلزم من وجود الجسم فيها وجود الحوادث فيها. So he's saying that if you go back, what does he say? He says that الحادث لو ثبت في الأزل. What's أزل? Azal is beginningless eternity. So Azal is the beginningless past. And Abad is the endless future. So you have the beginningless past and you have the endless future. So what do we mean by the beginningless past? Well, it depends on whether you are a Muslim, mutakallim, or whether you're one of the Falasifa. According to the Muslim mutakallim, the beginningless past refers to the fact that there's no time, that for every previous time you can posit a time before it. And according to the Falasifa, it means that for every previous time there is actually a time before it, back to beginningless eternity. So this is Azal. So Azal is the beginningless past in one of these two meanings. And then there's the endless future, which according to both the Muslims and the Falasifa, it's not just that you can posit a time after it, but there will actually be a time after it, because we're created for eternity, either in one of our two eternal abodes. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our good deeds and forgive us and make us from the eternal inhabitants of paradise. So he says that, so what's Azal here? Azal is the beginningless past. So he says, ما لا يخلو عن الحادث لو ثبت في الأزل. So he's saying this is an incoherent statement. It's an incoherent statement because you're using the word fi. And you're using the word fi and you're treating Azal as a time. It's as though you're saying that al-hadith were to exist in time X, then it would imply this. And so he's going to base his objection on that. It's not a very strong objection. And the answer to this objection is basically that with this, he doesn't mention the answer to this objection, but other of the muhashshun, they mention this. And they say, for example, Bajuri, he mentions that this means that the fi here is not a literal fi. What does it mean for a thing to be fil azal? It means that it does not have a beginning. He says it's so what we mean is ما لا يخلو عن الحادث لو ثبت في الأزل, i.e. if it didn't have a beginning, then it would entail that the hawadith do not have a beginning. It would entail that the hawadith, there would be hawadith la awwala laha. There would be events that wouldn't have a beginning, which is impossible. So the first objection is with fi. And so he's going to say you mean this and that's impossible, and this is the response to it. It's not really an important objection, but there's another objection that's embedded within it that is important. And so he says that الثالث أن الأزل ليس عبارة عن حالة مخصوصة. It's not a specific حالة, specific time. حتى يلزم من وجود الجسم فيها, يعني في ذلك الحالة وجود الحوادث فيها. That if there were so he says بل هو عبارة عن عدم الأولية أو عن استمرار الوجود في أزمنة مقدرة غير متناهية في جانب الماضي. So he is saying that when you use the word fi, you're treating. Oops, second. He says that when you use the word fi, you are treating azal as a specific time. You're treating azal as a specific time, but it's not a time. But what is azal? Azal is in reality it is ibara. It's an expression that means adamul awwaliya, the fact that something does not have a beginning. أو عن استمرار الوجود في أزمنة مقدرة غير متناهية في جانب الماضي. So when you say that azal is adamul awwaliya, then it's a non-temporal azal. It's like the qidam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Adamul awwaliya. It's unrelated to time. He says that if you say that azal is استمرار الوجود في أزمنة مقدرة غير متناهية في جانب الماضي, this is now a temporal azal, the beginningless past. He says muqaddara. Okay, so before I explain muqaddara, so I want you to understand that we say we agree with you. So in this objection, he's saying we say that yes, you're right. That's what azal is, and that's what we mean. So he's critiquing the use of the word fi and what you mean by this. And so we're saying our response to this is you're right, and that's not what we mean by fi. What we mean by azal is what you've just said. So this is not really, this is Taftazani doesn't say that explicitly. But it's implied. Bajuri brings it out in his Hashiyah. He says بل هو عبارة عن عدم الأولية أو عن استمرار الوجود في أزمنة مقدرة. What is he saying? Why is he saying أزمنة مقدرة? Because he's defining azal according to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. According to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the beginningless past is azmina muqaddara, are times that are muqaddara. Muqaddara means they are mafruda, which means they are posited, which means that they are not actual, they don't exist. So this is a zaman muqaddar. It means that any previous time you can think of a time before it, and you can think of a time before it, and this is, you can extrapolate back into the past. So it refers to the ability of the human mind to extrapolate into the past or into the future. Numbers are like that. You can extrapolate them, but according to the Falasifa, these azmina are not muqaddara, they're muhaqqaqa. They're actual azmina, because there's an actual beginningless past. And so, although he defines this according to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, this is actually like, in the objection, if the objection is the objection of the Falasifa, it should be muhaqqaqa here. It shouldn't be muqaddara. So a little bit of a confusion. So he says that استمرار الوجود في أزمنة مقدرة غير متناهية في جانب الماضي. He says ومعنى, so that's one thing. Okay, and we say we agree with you. Then he says ومعنى أزلية الحركات الحادثة أنه ما من حركة إلا وقبلها حركة أخرى لا إلى بداية، وهذا هو مذهب الفلاسفة. وهذا هو مذهب الفلاسفة. So this here is this objection is an objection that it needs to be responded to. So what do the Falasifa mean? So he's saying, so the Falasifa, if you want to use their terminology, they say that the al-harakatu قديمة بالنوع. What does that mean? It means that that movement is qadima with respect to the naw', with respect to the universal idea of movement. So every instance of movement is hadith. But since you have you have an unending number of movements, then movement in general is qadim. So they say, and so he's saying معنى أزلية الحركات الحادثة أنه ما من حركة إلا وقبلها حركة أخرى. We call this حوادث لا أول لها لا إلى بداية. وهذا هو مذهب الفلاسفة وهم يسلمون أنه لا شيء من الجزئيات الحركة بقديم. So they agree that every single instance of haraka is hadith. It's not qadim. So they agree that every single instance of haraka that you look at is hadith. وإنما الكلام في الحركة المطلقة. But what we are debating is al-haraka al-mutlaqa. Mutlaqa, i.e. al-naw'. It means the universal, the haraka in general. So this objection, how does this relate to the statement here? So what is the statement saying? The statement is saying, so this fee objection is not really relevant. He says, the mutakallimun are saying that which a jism that is always characterized by movement, which are haditha. If it were to exist, if it didn't have a beginning to its existence, then it would entail that you would have hawadith, that didn't have a beginning, unending series. وَهُوَ muhal. And the Falasifa are saying it's not muhal. Because so the mutakallimun are saying it's muhal. The Falasifa are saying it's not muhal because they are qadima bin naw'. Mutlaqul haraka is qadima. So this is their position, and there's a lot of ink that's spent responding to this position. And we'll look at it, inshallah. It's become a part of the Kalam tradition, but it will come in greater detail when we cover the next section of Sharh al-Aqaid, which is Huduth al-Alam. But for now, what does he say? He gives one answer, which is okay. So let's look at his answer. So what's his answer? He says, وَالْجَوَابْ أَنَّهُ لَا وُجُودَ لِلْمُطْلَقِ إِلَّا فِي ضِمْنِ الْجُزْءِ فَلَا يُتَصَوَّرُ قِدَمُ الْمُطْلَقِ مَا حُدُوثِ كُلِّ جُزْءٍ مِنَ الْجُزْئِيَّاتِ. So the Falasifa, they are saying that the universal concept of haraka is qadima, but the instances are haditha. So he's saying here that universals don't exist. Do universals exist or do they not exist? He's saying that the mutlaq, i.e. the universal, means kulli here, it only exists, it doesn't exist independently of the particulars. This is Taftazani, he's saying this. The dominant position amongst the mutakallimun is not this, but that it's that the idea, the universal concept of haraka actually has no existence at all, and it's something that we abstract from reality. We see individual haraka instances, and our mind abstracts from this the universal concept of movement, and this universal concept has an existence in the mind, and it doesn't have an existence outside of the mind. So either way, what ends up saying, the response becomes that the Falasifa are saying that al-harakatu qadima bin naw', but the naw' doesn't even have any existence. So how can you say that it's qadim? That's the response. That's the upshot of the response. لا وجود للمطلق إلا في ضمن الجزء فلا يتصور قدم المطلق مع حدوث كل جزئي من الجزئيات. However, what they're really saying when they say that mutlaqul haraka is qadima, what is not it's not related to the affirmation of the existence of a universal, but it's related simply to the fact that every haraka, there's a haraka before it. So you have to put aside this idea of universals and particulars, and prove that it's impossible for you to have an unending series of harakat into the beginningless past. And this is you either do you have to prove. So that's one response. So I showed you in the previous lesson that there's two ways to prove that the universe has a beginning that's not qadim. The first is that if something becomes qadim, then it ceases to be dependent. We'll look at that argument. The other argument, which is more common in books of kalam, is that existence for an infinite period of time is an incoherent concept. It's intrinsically impossible. And that's the response that they're going to give, and that's the response that needs to be given here. And there's a famous argument called Burhan at-Tatbiq, proof by correlation, that he's going to mention in the soon, and we'll see it when he does it. And he mentions it here. So what does he say in the Hashia? So if you look in the Hashia here, he says that. So he mentions what I just said, and he says فَيَجِبُ عَلَى الْمُجِيبِ and so this is the mujib. So in the bahth wal munazara, you have the muallil and you have the mujib. The muallil is the one who's critiquing the argument, and the mujib is the one who's responding to the critiques. So يجب على المجيب أن يبذل جهده في إبطال ما لا تناهي الجزئيات. He says that the proper response is that the mujib he tries utmost to show that the la tanahi, the unendingness of particulars, is batil. How do you do that? He says, إما بناء على ما ذكره الإمام الرازي من جريان برهان التطبيق في كل ما دخل تحت الوجود في الجملة ولو على سبيل التعاقب. So this is talking Burhan al-Tatbiq. This will come. We're going to look at it in detail in a future lesson. He says, أو على, and he gives another argument. We'll look at this argument. So just to get our feet wet. There's actually, he's saying there's only two, there's many more. There's probably 2 dozen ways of showing that an actual infinite is impossible. And what's important here is not the particular proof. So all of these, you have to, in order to understand the incoherence of an actual infinite, you can't get caught up in a particular proof. All of the proofs, they're trying to say the same thing. They're just telling you something that you already know intuitively, which is that it's not possible for, if something exists, it must be countable. If you can't count it, it's incoherent, and you feel the incoherence, and these arguments, they make it explicit. So here's one. He says أو على ما تقول من this is, he says كل واحد من تلك الحوادث لما كان مسبوقا بالغير كان جميعها بحيث لا يشذ عنها شيء منها مسبوقا بالغير أيضا. He says, what do you do? He says that if you take, so let's look at, if you take any one hadith, any one event, in our times you translate this as, this event is an instance of time. Time is an event. Time comes about as a result of change, as a result of events. Time and events are related. So if you take an event, okay, so if you take any event, and this event is preceded by something else, okay, everybody agrees. And so now you look at all of the events, take all of the events in their entirety. So if every single event is preceded by something else, and you take all of the events in their entirety, then they need to be preceded by something else. What are they preceded by? Well, they can't be preceded by another event, because you've taken all of the events. You're looking at all of them, and so they must be preceded by the absence of any events. In other words, they must have begun to exist. He says, أو على ما تقول من كل واحد من تلك الحوادث لما كان مسبوقا بالغير كان جميعها بحيث لا يشذ عنها شيء منها مسبوقا بالغير أيضا بالضرورة. This is known non-inferentially, that if every single one of them is masbuq bil ghayr, because it's hadith, then if you take all of them in their entirety, if each one is masbuq bil ghayr, then the whole thing is masbuq bil ghayr. ثم إن كان ذلك الغير لا يجوز أن يكون من جملتها ثم إن ذلك الغير لا يجوز أن يكون من جملتها. So he says that the hawadith as a whole, they're preceded by something else. This thing that they're preceded by cannot be another hadith. Why? Because you're considering all of the hawadith. They're all included in this thing, so it cannot be another hadith. So, وَإِلَّا لَزِمَ أَلَّا يَكُونَ مَا فَرَضْنَاهُ جَمِيعًا. Okay, otherwise, what you have done fard of would not be all of them. He says, بَلْ يَجِبُ أَن يَكُونَ خَارِجًا عَنْهَا. But rather, it's the thing that all of these hawadith are preceded by needs to be something else other than these hawadith. And in other words, it can't be something that's hadith. فَيَنْقَطِعُ بِهِ سِلْسِلَةُ الْحَوَادِثِ. And so the hawadith, the silsila, it must end. Now there's objections to this. We'll look at these objections probably next class, and we'll try to answer them. We'll go back and forth. But this is, it's actually the argument overcomplicates the thing that we are trying to prove, because it's very simple. If everything you observe is hadith, then all of the things as a whole must also be hadith. I have a beginning, you have a beginning, every single human being has a beginning, the tree had a beginning, and so the universe as a whole must have a beginning. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. It's a very intuitive, clear argument, and we'll go through the back and forth, but the back and forth can overcomplicate things, and it is overcomplicated. Infinity is an incoherent concept. Infinity is not a number, and things that exist, you must be able to count them, otherwise they don't exist. So that's basically it. So that's the third objection and its answer. The الرابع, last one, quickly, he says the fourth objection is أنه لو كان كل جسم في حيز لزم عدم تناهي الأجسام. So what is this based on? This is based on the meaning of hayyiz. So we say that every jism has a location. Every jism has a location, and based on this, Taftazani made the argument of movement and stillness, which is based on them having a location. The Falasifa, they want to say that no, everything does not have a location because they're mujarradat, and when they affirm these mujarradat, they escape from the argument of the mutakallimun. So they're trying to escape, and they say that it's not true that every jism has a hayyiz. Why not? He says because it comes from, why? Because he says al-hayyiz huwa as-sath al-batin min al-hawi al-mumas li-sath al-zahir min al-mahwi. So this comes. What is a hayyiz according to the Falasifa? Well, hayyiz is, so you have something that is al-mahwi. Mahwi is that which is contained, and then you have al-hawi. The hawi is the thing that contains. And so what's hayyiz according to them? Hayyiz is you take the hawi and the mahwi, and you look at the outer part of the sath, of the surface of the thing inside, and the inner part of the surface of the thing outside, and that thing is the hayyiz. That's what they define to be a hayyiz. That's the hayyiz of an object. This is related to their particular natural philosophy. They believe that the universe is replete, which means that they didn't believe in the existence of a vacuum. The Falasifa, they said that there's something in every location, and from this they came to a particular concept of location. It's not there's a long story. And I don't want to get into it because it's not relevant. But just we want to understand the dialectic, And the dialectic is they're saying that this thing this is what it means to have a hayyiz. So now if you say that the universe is finite, say the universe is finite, then the universe as a whole can't have a hayyiz because it's not contained by anything else. So if you say that every jism has a hayyiz, it means that okay, this has a hayyiz, it means it needs to be surrounded by something else. And that has a hayyiz, needs to be surrounded by something else. That has a hayyiz, needs to be surrounded by something else. And the result is لو كان كل جسم في حيز لزم عدم تناهي الأجسام لأن الحيز هو السطح الباطن من الحاوي المماس للسطح الظاهر من المحوي. So that's the argument. He says, well, the jawab is that's not what we mean by hayyiz. That's what you mean by hayyiz, يا أيها الفلاسفة. But that's not what we mean by hayyiz. الجواب أن الحيز عند المتكلمين, that's not what it is. هو الفراغ المتوهم الذي يشغله الجسم وينفذ فيه أبعاده. He says that what's a hayyiz, what's a location according to the mutakallimun? He said it's a faragh. Faragh is a space, and it's a space that's mutawahham. So according to the mutakallimun, what do they say? They say that space doesn't actually exist. The only thing that exists is the physical object, and the space that it occupies is something that the mind imagines. And so it's an imaginary thing that the object occupies. He says هو الفراغ المتوهم الذي يشغله الجسم وينفذ فيه أبعاده, and its dimensions, they go out and they go into it. And so they don't believe that there's such a thing as space. Is there such a thing as space? There may be. We're not, so when the mutakallimun, they say that there's no such thing as space, it's just something that the mind imagines. Here they're not functioning here as theologians, but they're functioning here as scientists, and we're not bound to this conclusion. So if somebody, but it may be true, may not be true. So I'm not saying it's false, I'm not saying it's true, but is there something as absolute space? Maybe. I need to review my physics, but according to the Big Bang Theory, it's increasing. There's more and more space with the universe is expanding, so it appears to be a thing. Allahu A'lam, you can look into it. But again, what I want this now, as I said, as I introduced this lesson, we don't want to do a tahqiq of these things. We don't want to, because this will then, if we say, is there space, is there not space? Now we get into philosophy and we go outside of theology. So we want to understand the dialectic, what they believed, how it's going back and forth, understand it at a high level. This gives us, we can now access the books of Kalam, and derive useful things from it. And then we need to look at our situation today and what people are saying today and how we use what they say here in a way to help people believe in our times. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.